Alrighty, time for another metagame review. This time it's going to be for the Lille Regional, the largest SWU tournament to date, 860 people. This was huge, and we are going to dive into what did well, what didn't. We'll take a look at some deck lists and do a full recap. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button, and if you're interested in some more content from me, do check out my Patreon as well. All right, so let's dive right in. I'm going to be covering the whole regional. I'm going to discuss what decks over and underperformed, look at some matchup statistics between some of the top performers. So this way we can kind of help identify what we should be playing in the future, or what are the things that we need to target in the future. And finally, I'll jump over to SWU Competitive Hub to look at the top 8 decks. That's always fun to see what won. All right, day one right here. Now, I don't think the day one meta share is the most important thing to be focusing on, but it does give us a little bit of an idea of what people are playing. Now, so far, what I've noticed in the sector qualifiers and now the regional is that even though there are clearly decks that are more popular, it still seems that a lot of people just come to these tournaments playing, honestly, whatever they feel like it. This time at least, we did have a deck kind of cross into that like pretty dominant day one percentage, which was Sabine ECL at 15%. We had Quinlan at 10%, but past that, it's pretty small, like 7% Qi'ra Data Vault, 5% CAD. Then we're all the way down into like the 3% and 2%. It's basically irrelevant. Like at that point, it's just such small numbers of people playing these decks that it's very kind of tough to even prepare into a wide field. I think the safest thing to do, of course, play a sturdy deck that's just kind of good. And we're going to see once again with conversion rates that most of the other stuff, the things that are not so popular, just kind of get phased out. The good decks that we keep seeing do well continue to do well. You'll see in the day one percentage, the one that really shocks me the most is the Han Green at only 2%. Only 22 people played this out of 860. That is a very, very small number. We see that Qi'ra's percentage has almost doubled her day one compared to the Richmond sector, where she was sub 4%. And then, of course, Sabine taking the biggest step forward. If you're interested in some base math here, we can see that Energy Conversion Lab, Data Vault, and Tarkintown all doing close to 20%. So between those three bases, we see about 60% of the field is covered, and then we have Yellow Generic at 12% and Colossus at 8%. That's just interesting to see. Like Data Vault specifically is taking a huge jump forward. ECL, not surprising that it's close to 20% because Sabine ECL was 15% of the meta alone. So it's only like 30 other ECL decks getting played in general. All right, let's take a look at day two. All right, so these two charts, in addition to one from the previous slide, were given to me by Sindori Magda on Discord. Did kind of a data parse through Melee to get a lot of these numbers. And that top graph is, for me, almost always the most interesting thing to see. It helps kind of determine what are the decks that did well in day one and kind of the ones that did poorly. So we can see the red bars are their day one percentage and the blue bars are day two. So anything with a higher blue bar compared to a red bar means that it kind of overperformed its initial day one share. And like Anakin this time did pretty well. It started at 5.5% of the field, ends at over 9% of day two conversion. Anakin is an interesting one because it had a very poor performance in Richmond. And we're going to see that a couple Anakins did make the top 8, and they were playing the 30 health blue base, not Colossus. So there could be kind of a shift in that deck construction. See Quinlan basically staying exactly where it was. So it didn't really overperform or underperform. It was about 10% day one, 10% day two. Sabine, though, pretty high conversion rate, 16% day one, and that's going to include the non-ECL versions, and then over 26% of the day two field. So Sabine really went wild. Qi'ra did pretty well again. Han Solo, not surprised that it over converted, especially because it started at such a low number as well. And we do see some poor conversions in the Bosk and the Cad Bane. Cad Bane especially was the fourth most represented deck, and I believe only one person playing Cad Bane actually converted into a day two. One that you won't even see here on the list is Boba. He started at 41 people playing, close to 5% of the field, 0 conversions to day two, so he's not even on that graph. Darth Vader, 30 players played it, 0 converted. Piet, 26 played it, 0 converted. So, you know, there's some decks that are still getting played. Now, that's not huge numbers, right? 30 people playing, 40 people playing. These are like 2, 3, 4% of the field. But these decks are continually not doing particularly well. And the decks that are continually performing well are like Sabine, Qi'ra, Han. Those three are probably the ones between the Richmond and the Lille Regional that are overperforming their day ones. And we're seeing a few decks that kind of have been back and forth, like Anakin and Cad. Like last time Cad overperformed and Anakin underperformed, they kind of switched spots this time. Quinlan is another one that has just been like very steady near the top of the day one field, but is now kind of staying neutral in terms of its conversion rates. And everything else, I mean, the data is simply just too small at that point. Like most of the leaders you see on this graph that have converted to day two, they're like one copy, right? It's like one Poe, it's one Thrawn, and none of these decks made top 8, and for the most part, they're kind of noise in the data. You should really be focusing on the ones that continually have large representations in day one and day two. All right, and this is my favorite graph because now we can see matchup percentages, and this isn't like the end-all be-all because play skill obviously creates a huge shift in this, right? This is accounting for everything that was played, and all things given created equal. If both players involved in any matchup are of equal skill, then this should be incredibly telling. But we don't know exactly what's happening in every matchup, but we're getting tons of data recently. Between this event and the Richmond, it's tons of games played, and we can start picking up trends. So you'll see Sabine Data Vault is being included on this list and had very, very high win rates. Spoiler alert, it won the whole tournament, but it was like a couple people playing this deck, and one of them went like 14-1. So of course this data is very high. Now, I don't really currently have an opinion on Sabine Data Vault. We're going to look at that deck list. It's a very interesting spin on building Sabine. Maybe it will overtake Sabine ECL as like the more sturdy Sabine deck. I can't tell you that yet. But as far as this matchup matrix is concerned, it's not surprising that it had basically positive win rates into everything because it won the tournament. But we can look at Sabine ECL, which did have a ton of data. And it had a winning record into Quinlan Tarkintown. I'm not surprised. I think the deck is pretty favored into Quinlan Tarkintown. It had a sub 50 this time against Qi'ra Data Vault, and in the Richmond sector, it was kind of flipped. It was close to this percentage, except in reverse. So, what is the real matchup spread between Sabine ECL and Qi'ra Data Vault? It's probably a pretty close matchup. Sabine ECL favored into Cad Tarkintown here, but barely. I think that matchup is also probably pretty close. Sabine ECL had an abysmal matchup into Han Green, and I think this is accurate. I think there are lines that Sabine ECL can take into Han Green that they can win. They usually involve a Sabine's Masterpiece on turn 2, with a turn 1 green ground unit, and sometimes they can race with lines that involve Darksaber and Rebel Assault, but for the most part, Han Green has a much easier path to victory. Sabine with a slightly sub 50% into Anakin, and then a lot of positive matchups across the board, most of the other things. Quinlan Tarkintown, once again, this is very similar to Richmond, underperforms into basically all the other top decks, except Anakin, Colossus specifically, and I think I would really be interested to see how Quinlan performs into the Anakin 30, because I think Colossus does make Quinlan's hand disruption package much better. And then this time, Quinlan had a positive win rate into Quinlan Tarkintown, and that was also kind of flipped in Richmond. But other than that, the other 3 top decks that I keep mentioning, Sabine, Qi'ra, and Han, Quinlan has a negative win rate into all 3 of those, and I think that is accurate. I think Quinlan is unfavored into all 3 of those matchups. I would go a step further and also say that Quinlan is unfavored into CAD, although the data here does not suggest that. It did in Richmond, and I can't tell you the data is right or wrong. I can just tell you my own experience playing both sides of that matchup. I feel like CAD is favored. So Quinlan is a very interesting deck because it has very good win rates into like most of the rest of the field, but I'm seeing a problem with this deck inherently when it has negative win rates into the other best decks, because it's going to make it it's going to make it probably a pretty good day 1 deck, but maybe not the best day 2 deck. Qi'ra Data Vault, which was a big riser after Richmond, continues its pretty steady over 50% matchups into most decks. It had a negative win rate into Boba Yellow. I think that's probably accurate, but I don't really believe Boba Yellow should be too much of a threat going forward, nor do I think it's something you really need to metagame for. But other than that, you can see positive into Sabine ECL at this tournament, positive into Quinlan, positive into CAD, very positive into Han Green, positive into Anakin. Qi'ra looks to be very well positioned. One did convert into the top 8, and we'll definitely keep tabs on Qi'ra going forward. CAD is the biggest loser, Quinlan Tarkintown, of this event. It was the 4th most represented deck, and it had abysmal win rates almost across the board. I think from all those top decks, the only one that it had a positive win rate into was Anakin Colossus. And then Han Green, another deck that I think this deck was wildly underplayed in this regional. It has very good rates into Sabine and Quinlan and CAD. These are really important matchups to target. It has positive win rates into Anakin. I think this is all pretty accurate. It had a pretty bad rate into Qi'ra. I don't think the matchup is this bad for Han Green into Qi'ra, at least for my own testing, but it is telling that it had a pretty poor record there. But do remember, this wasn't a large sample size for Han Green, so all we can do is look at this data as something to consider, not something to like completely accept as fact. And then Anakin Colossus, we saw earlier that Anakin kind of over-converted, but looking at this data would be like, how it's got losing records into everything. And unfortunately, I don't have the Anakin Blue data in front of me right now, the 30 health version, but because I do know that the 30 health version had 2 people in the top 8, I'm going to go ahead and assume that a lot of that maybe it was just the better version at this point, and that maybe the switch back to 30 health will prove beneficial for this deck in the future. But yeah, I encourage you to check this out. You'll see even more versions of I cut part of this data off because, at a certain point, these decks are getting so little play that I didn't think I need to talk about them here. But if you wanted to see even more data, do check out SWU Competitive Hub. You can see the full sheet there. All right, so now I'm going to jump over to SWU Competitive Hub to take a look at the top 8 decks, talk through them, see the really interesting winners list, and break it all down. All right, I'm over here on SWU Competitive Hub. It's time to look at the top 8 decks. Here you have them all in order. The winner was Sabine Data Vault, runner-up Anakin Blue, 30 health. 3rd and 4th place were Quinlan Tarkintown, Sabine ECL. Then we had another Anakin 30 health in 5th, a Rey Data Vault in 6th, another Sabine ECL in 7th, and a Qi'ra Data Vault in 8th. And we're going to go in reverse order here and start with the Qi'ra deck. So right here we got Qi'ra. Now I know this gentleman. He's in my Patreon stream tier. I've spoken to him about the build. It's very similar to the one I made a video on very recently, so if you're interested in getting all my thoughts on Qi'ra Data Vault of course, you can check it out there. It's over an hour and a half long of me talking about Qi'ra. But I see a couple changes here that he made, and they're very interesting. One, confiscate in the main deck. It's just one. There's another one in the sideboard, but I can see spike situations for this card, certainly. And there's a Lone Pike in the main deck, and I kind of like that. I've had Lone Pike in and out myself in Qi'ra decks. One thing this deck certainly lacks in general is Smuggle, and having a Lone Pike, although it's not nearly as good in a version without ECL, still gives you opportunities to play sometimes around discard, and it's just actually a really annoying card in the mirror of Qi'ra's because it's a very difficult unit to just remove outright. Outside of that, we kind of know this deck, right? We've got perimeter ATRTs now. This is kind of an evolution from playing Lieutenant Charlton because this is such a green heavy deck. Of course, the ATRT has less upside than a Charlton, but it also has a much higher floor because it will always have 5 health, which is a very important threshold for your Sentinel to have. And Charlton does have situations where, you only get him to a 4/4, and that does pose some problems. But Rey Data Vault has been a big winner in general in its performances over the last couple sectors. It's been having very good win rates into a lot of the top decks in the meta. It's a very sturdy deck, and it's not a particularly easy deck to counter, right? This is just mostly a pile of good blue and green cards. It's not a very synergy focused deck. There's a lot of talk about whether Data Vault is the way to go versus something like 30 health, of course, because you lose some of your ramp consistency, some of your odds to draw your power card like Overwhelming Barrage. But on the other hand, that extra life does change the dynamics a bit of matchups in general, not just in the sense that you would have won. You wouldn't have won a game where you ended at 31, but there's also situations where your opponents can put you in check much earlier with a 6 power unit when you're at 24, where they can't do that when you have 33 life, and it kind of changes the way your opponents have to play. So it's a very interesting mind puzzle to try to figure out what's better, because in reality, I don't think you're ever going to be able to really prove it one way or another, myself included. There's simply not going to be enough games and enough data and enough controlled environments to be okay, definitively 33 is better than 30, or definitively 30 is better than 33. ECL kind of separate from this because it probably changes the way you build this deck the most dramatically with all the units that you play with the ECL Qi'ra. But Qi'ra has been a big winner recently, and I expect its performances to continue. All right, let's look at the 7th place Sabine ECL. There's another Sabine ECL we'll look at as well. You can see a few, in general, Sabine has small flex slots. The majority of these decks are built very similarly, but we can see some variations. And one of them here is the R2-D2. Having a 1-drop to play gives you more ability to go wide early in the game, or especially on that flip turn. And a very interesting inclusion here is actually General's Blade instead of Darksaber. I think part of that is because of R2, because it lets you go 1+3 on the flip turn. It gives you an extra action to churn with Sabine. So when your opponents are trying to hold her hostage or play the action economy game, are being able to get another action from just playing R2 and then getting a General's Blade suited up on a unit can be pretty powerful. You see Sundari Peacekeepers, and I think a lot of decks now play both Cassian and Sundari Peacekeeper because having these 5 health units is a good play against both Quinlan and Cad Bane, where they sometimes just want to pass into you and you can just claim and play a 5 health unit and they can't ping Tarkintown it. Timely Intervention is a card that is being pushed into Sabine ECL. It's always been around. I see most of the decks are playing it, and I like that as well. You see 2 copies of Sabine Masterpiece. Honestly, I think when we see the win rates this deck had against Han Green, I think it's almost dangerous to not just put 3 of these in your main deck, since it is your best chance of actually winning a game against the Han Green. But I see the 3rd is in the sideboard, as are 3 Igor Escort Fighters, which I think is another concession to the Han Green, right? You're going to start on the ground, they're going to play a Falcon, and then your turn 2 play will be kill their Falcon. It's very similar to just playing open fire, although having the Escort Fighter means you will have a unit in cases where your opponent does not play a space unit, and you can just jam a 4/1. Confiscates are also pretty important, and I see them in the sideboard. They're good at, clearing Chewbacca's and other ways that Han Green can race you. And you see a decent amount of sideboard tech here for that matchup, and I don't blame them because that matchup is pretty poor for Sabine in general, and Sabine is having very powerful matchups kind of across the board otherwise. So congrats to Cyril here, who took this Sabine to a top 8 performance, and we're going to take a look at some other Sabines in a little bit. But next, Rey Data Vault, and this is Joshua, who even with Data Vault cannot ever consider playing the minimum in his deck. This is 62. Every time I cover an event, I see Joshua in the top 8, so he's definitely doing something right. He also kind of always plays a different deck, so we get to see a lot of how he brews and a lot of ideas. Rey Data Vault, I think Rey Data Vault, Luke Green, right? Even Obi Green or Lando Green. Like, these are all kind of plays on a very similar grindy blue-green hero mid-range deck, and they each do something a little different, and Rey allows you to play certain cards that you probably wouldn't otherwise play. Things like R2 and C-3PO and Clone Deserter, like Clone Deserter especially, where you can make a 3/4 on turn 1 with Rey's ability. She kind of buffs up a lot of these units that you probably wouldn't otherwise consider, and I do very much like Rey's ability. I think there's merit to a Rey Green build in general. I can't tell you that I think Luke is necessarily better, or Obi, or Rey, but I think there's a chance that Rey could be the best one. And let's take a look at some of the tech cards here. Entrenched, I think that seems like a pretty important card. You see that Joshua opted to not engage too much in space. You don't even see Concord Dons in this deck. It's just blue leaders, which of course can also just be a ground unit. You see home ones for the top end and just a couple copies of Bright Hope. I think Entrenched is often being used as some pseudo removal space units, and Traitorous is another way for this deck to reach into space. And I've liked Traitorous a lot and playing it in Qi'ra. I think Traitorous is just at an all-time high right now. You see a couple copies of Spark of Hope as well, in addition to the 3 resupply. So it is trying to up that ramp consistently for some matchups. And then, generically powerful blue removal like Takedown and Fell the Dragon. And then the kind of grind fest that blue-green hero can do with the tandem of U-Wing, Reinforcement, and Home 1. We see some more grind on the ground there with Mon Mothma, a card you don't typically see in a lot of these decks. I've seen it in Han Data Vaults, but now it's being moved into Rey, and of course Rey can buff that Mon Mothma, making it a little less of an embarrassing unit. You see Yodas to draw cards. You see 3 copies of Tech, right? So there's a lot of ways to grind value in this deck, and that's what this deck is. It's a value town engine that means to probably outgrind a deck like Qi'ra while having enough restore and interaction to beat decks like Sabine. And, I see, and we talked about it, the ways that this is trying to interact with space, because I certainly think that can be a weakness for this build in general. You see ways to reach across arena. I think Han Green deck in particular is something that this deck needs to be careful of. And you can see 3 Traders, 3 Entrenched, right? 3 Takedown, 3 Fell the Dragon, a lot of ways to try to reach up there without having to actually play your own space units, so that you can keep sticky restore units on the ground while your opponent is up in space. Post board restock. So, I think he understood that maybe these games were against blue-green villain were probably just going to end up going too long, and he was potentially susceptible to getting decked out. So he just opted to put a couple restocks in the sideboard to help protect against that. Salvage is another very grindy card. I think its primary target is going to be to basically be copies number 4 and 5 of Home 1, and maybe even it comes in with Reinforcement Walkers. And then 3 Rivals Fall. That's a lot of Rivals Fall, but maybe for any grind interaction, he just decided it's probably a little better than Vanquish in a lot of cases at that point, because it can kill a Palpatine, it can kill a Rey, it can kill a Cat or an Anakin, and maybe it's just better than Vanquish at that point. But very interested to see what Josh will play in the next event, because I very much enjoy checking out his deck lists. All right, in 5th place, the first of 2 Anakins, and like I mentioned multiple times already in this video, Anakin 30 health, not Colossus. Both copies of Anakin in the top 8 move to 30, and I'll talk a little bit about that first, right? Because I think the issue with Colossus right now is, Quinlan is a major part of the metagame, and Quinlan has continuously had a very good win rate into Anakin. And last set, I thought the matchup was pretty close. In fact, Anakin being such a difficult unit for Quinlan to kill because he's a 6 cost that Plo Koon can't actually finish in one shot, meant that a lot of cases Quinlan had to pivot into a control role once Anakin flipped. But Colossus has made that matchup worse for Anakin against that deck because they are so susceptible to getting hand-hated out of games. And I think there's a chance that you just need to go back to this 30 precisely because of that matchup. You see that this deck is still playing some of the stuff that was being used in the 35 health, like Steal a Guerrera for card advantage. It's a little more dangerous to do it with this version, right? But still not impossible. You see one copy of Red Squadron X-Wing. That was a card that was played in more copies in most of the 35 health versions. Their turn 1 plays a lot of 1/4s, 3 R2s, 3 Regional Governors. Regional Governor is pretty good in Anakin because it can kill other turn 1 plays without dying. I think 1/4s in general are pretty solid for that role, while also being a very interesting card against Han Green because they play so many turn 1 Millennium Falcon plays that it sometimes shuts off their turn 1 entirely. Cham Syndulla, fantastic in Anakin. It's just a great way into villain green decks or Han decks to just stay pace. We're not seeing C-3PO in this version, which I think is fine. I think when you're playing the 35 health, you need to devote even more attention to card advantage, but you're not that far down on cards in this version. I see 2 Entrenched in this deck as well, and I think a lot of decks are just adding that card right now in order to reach across arena in decks that just can't really compete on space. And this deck, 4 space units, 2 Anakin Interceptor just for turn 1, 1 Red Squadron X-Wing, and 1 Redemption in the main deck. You see a few, another Red Squadron X-Wing in the sideboard, but this is not a deck trying to fight in space. See main deck Pillages. I think Anakin, this player probably built in with Qi'ra in mind because it is a pretty difficult matchup. I think even with Pillages, it's a difficult matchup, but you're going to have a little more ways to target the hand between that and Force Throw in this deck. And with Steela, you might be able to grind them a little more, and you have Cham, so potentially you can match their ramp. So there are some concessions made there, and 2 Confiscates in the main deck as well. Confiscate showing up in a lot of decks right now. Post board, you got crates for the control matchups, top targets for Sabine, and then you see a lot of 1-ofs. These are basically all cards that are already in the main deck, right? The Cham, Confiscate, Entrench, Pillage will all be 3rd copies of all these cards, and then Red Squadron, X-Wing, and 1 Tech, these are going to be 2nd copies. So he's just trying to solidify. He's staying very flexible. His main deck is 1-ofs and 2-ofs of a lot of cards, and he's going to maneuver that in post board to be where it needs to be for games 2 and 3. And we'll also take a look at the other Anakin shortly. All right, time to look at the other Sabine ECL. This was the 4th place finish by Eroth, and we'll see if we can pick up any differences here. So one key difference that I'm seeing already is there's going to be 2 copies of Red 5, and I don't see that card in Sabine ECL very often. But something interesting that this card can, of course, do with ECL is take out 2 units sometimes. If your opponent has any damaged units in play, that can be incredibly valuable to just be able to double tap and get to a space unit and potentially a ground unit out of the way. Definitely an interesting add there. Probably a good card into young Han, who often does have damaged units kind of everywhere. Other notable cards, 3 Sabine's Masterpiece. I talked about that in the previous list. I do think because of the Han Green matchup, you probably should opt for 3 of those. This one does not have the R2 General's Blade. We're just old school with the Dark Saber in this deck, but this one also has the 2 Sundari Peacekeepers, right? The extra copies of the 5 health units. The 3rd Sundari is in the sideboard, as well as 2 extra copies of Confiscate in the sideboard to go with 1 main deck copy, which is definitely something that you can catch people off guard with in a Sabine deck in your main. Post board, you also have some extra grinding capability with U-Wing reinforcements. I see a 3rd for a cause in the sideboard. You know, the main deck's only playing 2. You know, I get it. For a cause is not great in a lot of matchups. It often does not come up in the mirror match. It often doesn't come up against like Haunt Green. It of course is quite powerful into like a Qi'ra deck. It can often finish off Quinlan. So, you know, there's good matchups, not so good matchups for it. Usually you see it as a 3. It is not a 3 here. You see a couple copies of Fighters for Freedom in the sideboard as well to bulk up your 3-drop slot, especially good against a card like Village Protectors, which can sometimes be really difficult for Sabine decks. Outside of that, you know, the main core of this deck, unchanged. We will see the main core of this deck change quite a lot once we look at the winner's version of Sabine. All right, in 3rd place, the Quinlan Tarkintown that made a very deep run in this event. You know, I've talked a bit about Quinlan in general, how I feel right now it's actually not very well positioned with negative matchups into Qi'ra, into Han, into Sabine, and I stand by that. It's still a very powerful deck. Its floor is quite high. It's a deck that's never really out of any game, but I do think that it can struggle a little bit into like the top field. But let's see what we got here brewing by I'm So Humble to kind of help target some of this stuff. So we see 2 copies of Disabling Fangfighter in the main, and I think this is purely a concession for the Han Green matchup. You know, it has other applications, right? It can kill a Traitorous out of Qi'ra decks. But at its core, I think it's being used to, you know, fight through the pilots and something like Chewbacca early, which can really give this deck fits. The Hand Hate package is still alive and well here, although we've trimmed a little bit. There's 2 Sparks in the main. There's 2 Qi'ras in the main, so it's not like all in on it, but it's still like incredibly all in on it, to be frank. I mean, it's still got 3 Ahsokas, 3 4-star. That's still a major part of this deck's strategy. You see 3 Grogus in the main deck, and that's not something that's always present in these decks, but it does give you that turn 2 4-star capability. It can help you into decks that are trying to go tall with like pilots potentially, where it's kind of exhausting 2 units at once, which is an interesting mechanic. All in on the 2/2 shielded units, 6 copies. I like that. I've often played all 6 of those in Quinlan decks. It just lets you stick around. Turning out that Coordinate for Plo is incredibly important. These units are sticky. I like 3 blasters in the main deck. 2 Surprise Strikes, you know. Why not 3? I guess we needed some room from other stuff. I get it, but like I still just want all the pumps. I think one issue this deck sometimes has is closing speed. Most of its units just hit for 3 damage. A lot of them only hit for 2. So it's sometimes difficult to like get there on action economy because you don't have ways to really hit for giant chunks of damage. You also are going to see 2 copies of the 6-drop Millennium Falcon in this deck to bulk up the smuggle, bulk up the space, be able to like potentially ambush into space units is a nice get. It's a card that was played much more in the previous set in the main deck. It kind of moved out of the main deck in the recent set, but now it's kind of making a resurgence. You also see 3 Bamboozles, not kidding around here, just all in on the Bamboozle stuff. It's really important to pilots. It's really important to Sabine, and these are 2 difficult matchups for this deck in general. So you got, well, pilots. I mean, by pilots I mean Han Green, but yes, those are both difficult matchups, and a couple waylays as well for more interaction. Post board, we're shoring up with some stuff like an extra Han, which there's only 2 of them in the main. A tech for the grindy games, Chams primarily for resupply decks. 3 Pillages, almost certainly for the blue-green villainy decks, where you're just adding all in on the hand disruption. And 2 Guerrilla Soldiers for probably a couple matchups. I expect they probably come in against Sabine, so that if your Sabine opponent passes turn 1, you can just slam it and kind of get the damage going. It can be sometimes good into other matchups like control decks that don't play units very often, so it has some flexibility. And one of Open Fire, probably another way to kill Falcons on turn 2. is just that extra 1 card. All right, now we'll look at the runner-up. This is another Anakin blue list. And here we have a different kind of take on this for sure. The space package is pretty different in this one. We do have Concord Dons this time. We also have 3 Fang Fighters and 3 Restored Arcs. So like basically a complete shift from what the space package in the other deck was doing. Where it had Anakin's fighter, it had like a redemption, and it had the Red Squadron draw card. Now that Red Squadron is a 3 of in the sideboard, as are 3 Steelas. So it looks like the post-board strategy for this player playing Anakin was to go full grind, right? 3 Red Squadrons, 3 Steelas, 2 crates, and a redemption. I feel like all 9 of those cards come in against control decks, and often won't come in a lot of other matchups, although you might see some of those draw engines come in against something like Quinlan. We also see Outer Rim Outlaws, and I really like this card with Anakin. 3/3 shielded unit that can hit for 5 with Anakin's ability, can definitely create big 2-for-1s. In this deck, you do see C-3PO again. Now, the main deck does not have nearly as much of a draw engine as the other 30 health Anakin we saw, because a lot of it is in the sideboard, but they did opt for an R2 Queel C-3PO main deck to potentially get some more card advantage going that way. There's also Poe Dameron in this deck as just a way to slam and kind of pivot into an aggressive stance with this deck. You also see Perilous Position. No entrenches in this version, but I think in a way it works in similar fashion, right? I think it's to slow down units going tall. It can help against some leaders. In conjunction with things like Fell the Dragon and the takedowns that are also in this deck, you do have that cross arena reach. You also see 3 Pillages in the main deck. So again, I think because this deck mostly struggles into controlling villainous decks, especially like blue-green villainous, you see both these Anakin players decided to opt for more main deck hand disruption, where a lot of the time we're seeing these cards come in out of the sideboard. But yeah, both these Anakins did very well, and we'll see if this creates a new shift back to 30 health from the Colossus versions. I'm not sure it will, but it looks like at least if people are just taking like top 8 results, they might start picking up the 30 health versions. And I can't tell you the exact matchup spreads that these Anakins had compared to the Colossus. We saw in the matchup matrix that the Colossus Anakin didn't have fantastic win rates into a lot of meta decks, but then we still saw Anakins convert pretty well. So it might have been a lot to do with these 2 players and maybe a few others playing 30. All right, and finally, we are going to see the winner, and the winner is Sabine Green again. It was also the winner in the Richmond sector, so both major tournaments since the Django suspension have been Sabine. But this is not Sabine ECL. This is Sabine Data Vault. We've got a 33 health Sabine taking this down, eliminating what maybe was considered the most important card of the Sabine Green deck, which is Energy Conversion Lab, a card that is absolutely broken with 6 cards that are actually still in this deck, right? Poe Dameron and Wrecker. But it's gone, and it won, and we're going to have to see now where this takes us. Is this going to be the start of a shift from Sabine ECL into a 33 health version? Data Vault in general is performing very well. I can't speak to why this player chose to move away from Sabine ECL. I'm sure they did extensive testing and found that it was better in some important matchups, potentially the mirror. I could see that 8 health, even with losing that board control tool that Sabine has with ECL. Like that 8 health might just be impactful enough. Now, they're still got ambush in this deck. There's 3 timely interventions. I'm sure those came up a lot, and you still see like a big core of the deck is relatively unchanged, like the early units, right? You still have the 6 turn 1 space units, you've got Battlefield Marine, you've got Sabine unit. Now there are 6 other turn 1 plays in this deck. There's 3 Ketsus and 3 Frisks. These are 3/2s that you can play on the ground. Frisk also has some piloting utility as well, being able to blow up cheap upgrades. after that, the 3 drops, well, we got to go heavier there as well. We've got Cassian and Sundari, which we've seen all over the place, but we also are getting red 5s as a 3 of, and Fighters for Freedom. So just bulking up, right? Like similar to how like the Qi'ra Data Vaults or like the Rey Data Vault or a lot of these Data Vault decks are working, is that they're taking cards that they were already playing and just turning them all into 3 ofs. And this deck is almost entirely 3 ofs, or is it? It actually is just entirely 3 ofs. There are 20 unique cards in this main deck. Then there are 3 unique cards in the sideboard and 1 bombing run. So this player played the absolute minimum different cards possible. And, you know, we got some weird ones in here as well. Senatorial Corvette, just a big space unit that 2-for-1s its opponent. Very good into Qi'ra decks, by the way. That card is a very difficult unit for Qi'ra to deal with, which operates a lot on 1-for-1 removal and does not always have great interaction for space. You see 3 Radis, probably the most interesting card in this deck, I will have to say. This is not a card you see very often. It says, while you control another resistance card, this gains Sentinel. Now, there's not a ton of resistance cards in this deck, but it also just always has the when defeated ability. So when it dies, it kind of always blows something else up. So, you know, if you can give this Sentinel, it really will put a big wall on your opponent. But I don't know how reliably it was able to turn on. But certainly, I'm sure it did something if this player opted to run it. You see a Delphi Patrol Wing. It's a card that you don't often see in Sabine. You see it a lot in like Han 2 ECL decks because it can play that Patrol Wing for 1 cheaper, and then it does like a Fleet Lieutenant impersonation. Now, you don't see Fleet Lieutenant in this deck. You're not seeing Wing Leader either. It is less Rebel heavy, although there are still a lot of Rebels. You still see Rebel Assault in this deck to help push damage, but not the other kind of core Rebel synergy matter cards. Blue Leader as well. So you see a little more interaction out of this deck, like Blue Leader being able to like ambush innately without that ECL to help you take control of the board. And post board, you know, Champs and Doulas, we're ramping. This deck is not aiming to just only try to win real quick against control decks. I see 3 Champs and 3 Crate Dragons in this sideboard. There was a plan here that was not just try to turbo out damage. 3 Disabling Fang Fighters as well. Talked about how good cards like that and Confiscate are right now, so I get it. One bombing run. Maybe it's because he couldn't figure out what that last card should be because he wanted everything to be 3 ofs, but, you know, maybe he played against the Vader and just instantly won the game because of his bombing run. We'll never know. Well, maybe we will, because I believe this player will be making a video about this deck with his team. So this is awesome. Like, seeing something like this come out of left field. Now, I know it's Sabine, right? It's Sabine Green. We're not completely reinventing the wheel here, but this is pretty different, and it's not something I think a lot of people had on their radar to prepare for, certainly, but even to test. I don't know how many groups or how many individuals this were like, oh, you know what Sabine needs to do? Cut ECL. That'll make him win more. Well, this person thought outside the box and took down the largest tournament to date. So congratulations to Jonas for bringing this to my attention and to everyone else's attention. And it's going to be very interesting to see kind of how, will this end up being like a flash in the pan, or will we now see kind of convergence on Data Vault Sabine, and it won't only be exclusively Sabine ECLs moving forward. Can't tell you right now, but looking forward to find out. All right, that's what I got for you. Do check out SWU Competitive Hub if you want some even more of this matchup matrix, if you want to see lists that go further down from the top 8, which is also very valuable. I don't think the only thing that's important is the top 8. It's just the ones that I'm covering right now, but you can check them out on the Melee link as well. You can basically see anyone's deck list that way. They all become public after the event is over. So you can see all the way down as far as you can go. You can see all the top 64 from that made day 2 if you're interested. And there's lots of cool stuff to find out. But yeah, hit that subscribe button. Check out my Patreon. And until next time, take care.